I wasn't looking for the date. I was looking at the ceiling. That's how it always starts. Not with a grand theory, not with a forbidden book, but with a moment of idle curiosity that refuses to let go. I was standing in the main hall of a train station you've probably seen in photographs, though I won't name it yet. The place was cavernous, the kind of space that makes you feel small in a way that isn't unpleasant. And I noticed above the ticket counters a carved stone medallion. It was detailed, ornate, the kind of craftsmanship that takes months of labor from someone who learned the trade, from someone who learned it, from someone who learned it when the world still moved at a slower pace. And on that medallion, carved into the stone, was a date. Not the year the station opened, not the year the railway company was founded. A date that, according to the official record, should not have been there. I checked it twice. I photographed it. I went home and looked up the history of that station, expecting an error in my reading, a Roman numeral I'd misidentified. What I found instead was a pattern so consistent, so quietly absurd, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every grand train station, the soaring vaults, the marble floors, the vast arched windows, was built before the trains arrived, not just before, sometimes decades before, sometimes before the locomotive had even been invented. And the official story, when you actually pull it apart, doesn't explain that. It explains around it. It explains past it. It asks you not to look at the ceiling. So I looked. The official story is simple, and you've heard it 100 times. The 19th century was the age of steam, the age of iron, the age of the great railway boom. Cities across the world, from London to Mumbai to Chicago to Moscow, were suddenly connected by steel ribbons. And because travel became fast, because the middle class began to move, because commerce demanded it, the great cathedrals of transport were built. Grand Central Terminal in New York, completed in 1913. St. Pancras in London, opened in 1868. Gare du Lyon in Paris, finished in 1900. The narrative is one of progress, of engineering catching up to ambition. The railroads needed terminals, and the terminals needed to be monumental, because the railway was the future, and the future needed to look impressive. We are told that these buildings were designed by architects who embraced the new industrial age, who fused classical forms with modern iron and glass. We are told that the construction took years, that the funding came from private companies, that the stations were inaugurated with ribbon cuttings and speeches. And for the most part, that is true. The ribbon was cut. The speeches were given. But the buildings themselves, the shells, the structures, the load-bearing bones, those raise a far more uncomfortable question. Because if you look at the construction timelines closely, if you dig into the archives, you find a recurring oddity. The grandest train stations in the world were not built in a few years. They appeared fully formed in a remarkably short window, often before the railway lines that would serve them were even surveyed. The official story says the railway boom created the stations. The evidence suggests something else. The stations were there, waiting for the railways to catch up. The first crack came from a photograph. I had found it in a digital archive of the New York Public Library, a glass plate negative, undated, cataloged under unidentified construction site. The image showed a vast iron framework, a lattice of girders rising above a muddy excavation. In the background, unmistakable, was the familiar bulk of Grand Central Terminal's facade, though it looked rougher, less finished. The cataloger had filed it as Grand Central Construction circa 1908. That seemed plausible. Grand Central's official completion was 1913, so 1908 would have been right in the middle of the work. But I looked closer. The iron framework in the foreground wasn't the kind of temporary scaffolding used by builders. It was too permanent, too carefully engineered. It was the skeleton of a building that was nearly complete, not one just beginning. And behind that skeleton, the facade of Grand Central, the one that supposedly wouldn't be finished for another 5 years, looked fully dressed. The stone was in place. The windows were glazed. I zoomed in as far as the digital file would allow, and I saw something that stopped me cold. A flagpole with a date on its base. I couldn't make out the numerals clearly, but the style of the flagpole, the ornamentation, the type of cast iron used. I had seen that design before, in a book about 1890s civic architecture. So I did what you do when one detail doesn't fit. I went looking for more. And I found that the official construction timeline of Grand Central is riddled with these contradictions. The station's cornerstone was supposedly laid in 1903, but photographs from 1901 show the site already excavated, already filled with steel. The building's vast main concourse, with its vaulted celestial ceiling, was painted in 1912 according to the records, except that a newspaper article from 1898 describes the ceiling as already dark with age. The painting was supposedly new, but the patina was already old. Make of that what you will. Then there is the matter of St. Pancras in London. The official completion date is 1868, and it is often called the greatest monument of the Victorian railway age. But the station's famous train shed, the single-span iron and glass roof that was the largest in the world at the time, was designed by an engineer named William Barlow, or so we are told. Barlow was a brilliant man, no question, but the problem is that his design appeared fully realized, without sketches, without preliminary studies, without the usual iterative process that marks any great engineering work. The archives at the Institution of Civil Engineers contain only the final plans. There are no drafts, no revisions, no notes in the margins. It is as if the design arrived, whole, from nowhere, and then there is the stonework. The station's frontage is a riot of Gothic detail, but the masonry shows tool marks that predate the 1860s. Restoration workers in the 2000s found that the stone blocks had been carved with techniques that were obsolete by the mid-19th century, techniques that required a level of hand finishing that would have been impossibly slow for a project on a deadline. The stones appear to have been repurposed, or perhaps reused from an earlier structure. The official story says the station was built new. The stones tell a different tale. They had been cut, dressed, and aged before the first railway line reached the site. Consider, too, the case of Gare du Lion in Paris, which opened for the 1900 Exposition Universelle. The station is famous for its clock tower, which rises 67 meters above the tracks. The tower is visible from across the city, and it was intended as a beacon of modern Paris. But here is the detail that bothers me. The tower's clock mechanism was manufactured in 1883, 17 years before the station was built. 17 years is a long time for a precision instrument to sit in a warehouse, waiting for a building that didn't yet exist, and it wasn't just the clock. The station's restaurant, Le Train Bleu, is a masterpiece of Belle Epoque decoration. It opened in 1901, but the gold leaf on its ceiling shows we're consistent with decades of use, not months. A chemical analysis of the paint layers, published in a 2005 conservation study, revealed that the underlayer of paint had fully cured before the top layer was applied, a process that takes at least 20 years. The station's official age is a little over a century. The paint says it was old before it was new. And then I found the records for a station that was never finished. In the archives of the Cincinnati Museum Center, there is a set of blueprints for a train terminal that was supposed to be built in the 1880s. The blueprints are detailed, beautiful, full of soaring arches and vast waiting rooms. They were drawn by an architect whose name appears in no other record, a man who supposedly died before construction began. The project was abandoned, the blueprints filed away. But here is the strange part. In the 1930s, when the city finally built its Grand Union Terminal, the design bore an uncanny resemblance to those 1880s blueprints. The same central dome, the same arrangement of concourses, the same dimensions within a few feet. The architect of the 1930s terminal claimed never to have seen the earlier drawings, but the resemblance is so exact that it cannot be coincidence. It is as if the building was already designed, already waiting, and someone simply dusted off the plans. And if you look at the foundation work for the 1930s terminal, you find something else. The concrete footings were poured in 1929, but the soil beneath them shows compaction consistent with a much older structure. There were, in the words of the site engineer, anomalies in the substrata. He didn't elaborate. The report was classified. But the implication is clear. Something heavy had stood on that spot before the terminal was built. something that required deep foundations, something that was removed, cleared away, and then replaced with a train station that looked exactly like a design from 50 years earlier. But here is where it becomes difficult to explain. The pattern is not limited to Western Europe and North America. In Mumbai, formerly Bombay, stands the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, originally called Victoria Terminus. It was completed in 1887, a staggering piece of Victorian Gothic architecture that looks more like a cathedral than a railway station. The official story credits the British colonial architect Frederick William Stevens, who supposedly designed it in a fever of inspiration after studying Gothic buildings in Belgium. But the archives at the Maharashtra State Archives contain a curious document, a letter from Stevens to his superiors dated 1882, in which he complains that the original structure on the site was inadequate to the needs of the railway and would require substantial modification. The phrase original structure is never explained. What original structure? The site was supposedly empty before construction began, and yet Stevens mentions modifications, not new construction. He says the building needed to be adapted, not erected. If you look at the terminus's stonework, you find that the lower courses of the facade are carved from a different type of basalt than the upper stories. A basalt that is not local, that was quarried from a site that had been closed since 1760. The building, in other words, was built on foundations that were already old, using stone that had been cut over a century before the railway arrived. The official story says the terminus was built from scratch. The stone says it was assembled from pieces that predate the British Raj. And then there is the case of the station that was never a station at all. In the city of Lyon, France, there is a building known as the Gare des Brotteaux. It was opened in 1908, a grand Beaux-Arts structure with a vast waiting room and a clock tower that mirrors the one at Gare du Lyon. But the Gare des Brotteaux was closed in 1983, and it now sits empty, preserved as a historical monument. When the city conducted a structural survey in the 1990s, engineers made a puzzling discovery. The building's foundations extended far deeper than necessary for a train station. They reached down over 12 meters into bedrock, with a complexity of vaults and chambers that had no function in the station's layout. The chambers were empty, but they were lined with brick that was centuries old. The city's historical commission labeled them medieval, but that is a polite word for we have no idea. The building, they concluded, had been constructed atop an earlier structure of unknown purpose, a structure so massive that the station was essentially a shell built around it. The official record says the station was built in 1908. The foundations say it was anchored to something that was already there, something that predates the railway by hundreds of years. And if you read the original planning documents, which were unearthed in a 2012 archive digitization project, you find that the station's architects were instructed to preserve the existing underground volumes, not excavate, not clear, preserve. The builders knew what was down there. They built around it, they built on top of it, and then they never mentioned it again. Continue seamlessly from the first half. And then there is the case of the station that was never a station at all. In the city of Lyon, France, there is a building known as the Gare des Brotteaux. It was opened in 1908, a grand Beaux-Arts structure with a vast waiting room and a clock tower that mirrors the one at Gare du Lyon. But the Gare des Brotteaux was closed in 1983, and it now sits empty, preserved as a historical monument. When the city conducted a structural survey in the 1990s, engineers made a puzzling discovery. The building's foundations extended far deeper than necessary for a train station. They reached down over 12 meters into bedrock, with a complexity of vaults and chambers that had no function in the station's layout. The chambers were empty, but they were lined with brick that was centuries old. The city's historical commission labeled them medieval, but that is a polite word for we have no idea. The building, they concluded, had been constructed atop an earlier structure of unknown purpose, a structure so massive that the station was essentially a shell built around it. The official record says the station was built in 1908. The foundations say it was anchored to something that was already there, something that predates the railway by hundreds of years. And if you read the original planning documents which were unearthed in a 2012 archive digitization project, you find that the station's architects were instructed to preserve the existing underground volumes. Not excavate, not clear, preserve. The builders knew what was down there. They built around it, they built on top of it, and then they never mentioned it again. But the most unsettling evidence comes not from the stations themselves, but from the maps that show where they were placed. Consider the railway networks of the late 19th century. In Europe, the major lines radiated from cities like Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. In North America, they converged on hubs like Chicago, St. Louis, and New York. The engineering required to lay these routes was immense. Tunnels through mountains, bridges across rivers, grades that had to be precisely calculated. But if you overlay a map of the major railway lines from the 1870s onto a map of the ancient Roman road network, something strange emerges. They align, not approximately, precisely. The railway from Paris to Lyon follows almost exactly the route of the Via Agrippa, a Roman road built in the 1st century BC. The line from London to York traces the course of Ermine Street, a Roman military road. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which was supposedly built through virgin wilderness in the 1890s, follows a path that shows up on Chinese maps from the Yuan dynasty. The official explanation is that these routes were chosen because they offered the most level terrain. But the Roman roads were not built for railways. They were built for marching legions and supply wagons. They follow the most defensible high ground, not the most efficient gradient. A railway engineer would not have chosen those routes, and yet they did. It is as if the lines had already been surveyed, already laid out, long before the first locomotive was built, as if the railway was simply filling in a pattern that was already there. And then there is the matter of the stations that were built but never used. In the archives of the Hungarian State Railways, there is a record of a station in the town of Székesfehérvár, completed in 1896. It is a magnificent building with a central hall that rises to a height of 30 meters, a facade decorated with statues and carvings, and a clock tower that can be seen from miles away. The official story says it was built to serve the Budapest-Trieste line, but the line was never completed. The tracks were laid only as far as the station itself. The building stands at the end of a railway line that goes nowhere. It was fully equipped, ticket counters, waiting rooms, a restaurant, even a royal waiting room for the Austro-Hungarian emperor. But the trains never came. The station was used as a warehouse for a few decades, then abandoned. It sits today, preserved as a historical monument, a ghost of a railway that was supposed to connect two empires, but never did. Why build such a structure if the tracks were not going to reach it? The official answer is that the project ran out of funding. But the building cost a fortune. The statues alone, carved from Carrara marble, would have taken years to complete. Someone knew in 1896 that the trains would never arrive, and they built the station anyway. The pattern is not just European. In the United States, there is the example of the Cincinnati Union Terminal, which I mentioned earlier. But consider also the case of the old Pennsylvania Station in New York. It was demolished in 1963, but photographs show a building that was more like a Roman bathhouse than a railway terminal. The main waiting room was modeled on the baths of Caracalla, with a vaulted ceiling that was 150 feet high. The columns were solid granite, each one weighing 80 tons. The floor was laid with marble from Vermont, Italy, and France. The building was completed in 1910, but the granite columns were quarried in 1902, 8 years before the station opened. And the marble floor was cut in 1903, 7 years before. These are not materials that were stockpiled on speculation. They were cut to precise dimensions for a specific building, which means that the building's design was finalized, and its materials ordered years before the official groundbreaking. But the official groundbreaking did not take place until 1906. So what was being built between 1902 and 1906? The official record says the site was being cleared, but the photographs from that period show something else. a massive excavation with foundations that go down 40 feet into bedrock. That is not clearing. That is construction. The building was already rising before the groundbreaking ceremony. The ceremony was a performance. The station was already there. And then there is the question of the technology. The grand train stations of the 19th century are filled with ironwork, glass, and stone that seem to exceed the capabilities of the era. The train shed at St. Pancras in London has a single-span arched roof that is 240 feet wide. It was completed in 1868. The structural analysis, published in a 1987 engineering journal, concluded that the iron ribs of the roof could not have been fabricated without a degree of precision that was not available until the 1890s. The rivets are too uniform. The metal is too pure. The tolerances are too tight. The engineers who studied it said the roof was a century ahead of its time. They meant it as a compliment. But if you read that phrase literally, it means the roof was built with technology that did not exist. The official story says the iron was forged in Derby, but the forge records from Derby show no order for curved iron ribs of that size. The records are missing. They were destroyed in a fire in 1871, a fire that conveniently erased the paper trail for the single most advanced piece of ironwork in the Victorian era. Make of that what you will. Consider also the glass. The great train stations of the world are famous for their vast windows and skylights. The Gare de l'Est in Paris has a glass roof that covers an area of over 2 acres. It was supposedly completed in 1849. The glass panels are each 4 feet by 6 feet, made of a type of plate glass that was not commercially produced until the 1860s. The glass is flawless. There are no bubbles, no distortions, no signs of the hand-blown process that was standard in 1849. The official explanation is that the glass was imported from England, where the process was more advanced. But the British customs records from the 1840s show no export of large-format plate glass to France. None. The glass is a mystery. It is too perfect, too large, too uniform. It is glass that should not exist in 1849, and yet it is there, holding back the rain and snow for 170 years. Now step back and connect the dots. What is the pattern that emerges from these anomalies? The official story says that the grand train stations of the world were built in the late 19th century as a celebration of railway technology, as monuments to progress and industry. But the evidence suggests something else. The buildings are too old. Their foundations predate the railways. Their materials were cut decades before construction. Their designs were already complete long before the ground was broken. The railways themselves follow routes that are ancient, and many of the stations were built for lines that never came. It is as if the stations were not built for the railways. It is as if the railways were built to serve the stations. As if the stations were the primary structures, and the tracks were merely an afterthought. What if the grand train stations were not built in the 19th century at all? What if they were already standing, already finished, and the railway age simply moved in and repurposed them? The official history says that the stations were built to accommodate the new technology. But what if the technology was built to accommodate the stations? What if the locomotives and the tracks were developed specifically to connect these existing structures? The stations would then be the anchors of a network that was already mapped, already built, but whose original purpose has been forgotten. The railways would be the cover story, the plausible explanation for why these vast buildings stood at the centers of cities, connected by straight lines that cross continents. Who would have built them, and why? The alternative theory suggests that there was a civilization before the one we know, a global culture that constructed these monumental buildings for a purpose we no longer understand. They were not train stations. They were something else, halls of assembly, temples, centers of a network of energy or communication that the railways merely imitate. And then something happened. A flood, a war, a collapse. The civilization was buried, forgotten. The buildings survived, but their purpose was lost. When the railway age dawned, the builders of the 19th century found these empty structures and claimed them. They added tracks, installed clocks, painted over the old murals. They rewrote the history. They said the buildings were new, they said the trains were the reason, and the record was cleaned, erased, sanitized. Who benefits from this forgetting? The official history does. The story of progress, of linear development, of a steady march from primitive to advanced. The idea that we built these wonders with our own hands in a single generation is a comforting myth. It tells us that we are capable of greatness. But if the buildings were already there, if they were inherited from a previous age, then our story is not one of achievement but of occupation. And that is a story that the official record does not want told. How was the erasure carried out? Through archive fires, missing blueprints, destroyed forged records. Through photographs that were never taken, letters that were never written. Through the simple act of forgetting. A building is repurposed, its original function lost, and within a generation the new story becomes the only story. The foundations that are too deep, the stone that is too old, the glass that is too perfect. These are the clues that survive the erasure. They are the fingerprints of a lost world. And so we are left with questions. Who really built the grand train stations? Why does the official record begin exactly when the railways arrived? What was standing on those sites before the first line was drawn? Why are the foundations always older than the building? Why are the routes always following ancient roads? And why, in every case, is the evidence just out of reach? A fire, a missing document, a report that was classified. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. The gaps are too convenient to be accident. The stations are still there. You can walk into St. Pancras today and feel the weight of the stone, the height of the vault. You can stand in the Gare de l'Est and look up at the glass that should not exist. You can sit in the waiting room of the Gare des Brotteaux, empty and silent, and wonder what was there before. The buildings remember. The foundations remember. The stone remembers its age even when the records do not. The trains are gone, the stations remain. And the question is not whether they were built before the trains. The question is, what were they built for?